I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalimahorra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalimahorra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalimahorra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalimahorra with me, George Galloway, in London for Al Mayadeen television, discussing Afghanistan and Iraq. Wars of medieval length are coming to an end, or are they? Certainly, the presidency of the United States has decided, at least they say they have decided, because they've said that before but didn't do it, that they will withdraw their forces from the two theatres of operation that they entered in earnest in 2001 in the case of Afghanistan, in 2003 in the case of Iraq. 1 million dead later, an ocean of blood later, extremism and fanaticism cascading around the world later, will history judge these two wars to have been, in the words of Talleyrand, not just a crime but a blunder? A crime goes without saying. In the case of Iraq, an absolutely blatantly illegal attack on another member of the United Nations. Don't take my words for that. Take the words of the then Secretary General Kofi Annan. In the case of Afghanistan, there was approval for the limited scope of extirpating the Al-Qaeda bases in Afghanistan, but not for the wholesale occupation of the land for 2 decades. But whether or not you agree with me that these two operations were crimes, no one could seriously doubt that they were blunders. Blunders in the sense that they achieved none of the goals that were set for them by the perpetrators of them, and I want to argue have achieved precisely the opposite. As I said to Mr. Tony Blair in the library corridor of the House of Commons, outside the gentleman's lavatory to be precise, just weeks before the Bush and Blair invasion of Iraq, I said to him, and I quote myself if you'll forgive me, "There are no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but there will be 100,000 Al-Qaeda in Iraq if you and Bush invade it. And moreover, those will then spread out across the world and end up," I said prophetically, "even here in this building, looking for you, maybe even looking for me." Not only that, but the fall of Baghdad will not be the beginning of the end, I said, paraphrasing Mr. Churchill, but merely the end of the beginning. And thirdly, that the Iraqi people will fight you with their teeth, if necessary, until they have driven you from their land. These three predictions all came true, even the one about Al-Qaeda in the corridors of the Houses of Parliament in London. So I have a history and a very firm view on these matters. But I'm just the enthusiastic amateur. I'm joined this evening by a group of distinguished experts, and let me give them their say. Now, it is Kalimahorra, of course. That means free word. We're all free to speak our words here. Dr. Lily Hamourtziadou, I thought I'd stumble over the second name, not the first, is a senior lecturer in criminology and security studies at Birmingham City University, and is the author of a very fine book called Body Count: The War on Terror and Civilian Deaths in Iraq. Because, Dr. Lily, numbers are important, aren't they? They would be if they were our numbers. Not so much if they are Iraqi and Afghan numbers, but they were to you. Tell us why.
It is not only numbers that are important to me and to us at Iraq Body Count, it is also names, incidents, methods of killing, perpetrators of crimes. Everything is important, which is why I have documented every day the security situation, the violence in Iraq. It is very important to get even the smallest detail, because these deaths matter, because those civilians are just like us. And as my death would matter, so an Iraqi death matters. And as you were saying, this was a blunder in the sense that an entire society has been destroyed. But I'm not sure it was a blunder in the sense that there is now an instability in Iraq that we profit from.
Well, you're right. It's not a blunder for some because they profit from it. But it's a blunder from the point of view of the people of those countries, of their neighbors, and of society as a whole. No one could seriously dispute that the radicalization, fanaticization of a significant part of the Muslim population of the world is unrelated to what they watched on their television happening to Iraq and Afghanistan, could they?
That's right. And by documenting deaths, we don't just honor the dead or recognize the tragedy of the civilian carnage that is taking place, but it also allows us to look at trends in the violence. For example, when troops leave, does the violence end? Who is primarily being targeted through these attacks? What does that tell us about what kind of conflict that is? So by documenting deaths, we can get a bigger picture of the conflict itself.
Indeed, we will come, I promise you, into whether or not things will get worse once the occupying forces have left, rather than better. Carol Gould is an American writer and broadcaster who lives in England, our gain, America's loss, since the mid-2000s. She's appeared regularly as a commentator on radio and television. Carol, welcome back to Kalimahorra. You are an American. Your country's forces were by far the biggest component of both invasions. 20 years on, how do you look back on it now?
You talked about the blunders, and we've already talked about the violence. And when you think that now, 18 years after the Iraq invasion, the Iraq adventure, I call it, by the US, I'll start with Iraq, that al-Kadhimi, the prime minister, recently was the subject of almost a fatal attack because of the factions that are acting in Iraq. Afghanistan, 20 years on, both of them, I think the word that you use, blunders, I wouldn't say catastrophes, but they have gone nowhere. They've been hiding to nowhere, just going in circles. An interesting book by Michael Oren, who was the Israeli ambassador to the US, wrote a very interesting book, and it's true. It's called Power, Faith, and Fantasy. He wrote it 15 years ago about the Americans' inability to understand the Muslim world for 250 years, since the time of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, to understand not just the Muslim world, but the world outside the United States. Going back to that period of time throughout the 19th century, 20th century, but now in the past, this 20 years of the Afghanistan and Iraq adventures, as I call them, we've seen a total misunderstanding of the culture, of the complexities of the factions, and the way that world operates, the way it functions, and its culture. And this is a blunder of Democrat and Republican presidents, of administrations going back before I was born.
Well, a necessary concomitant of that question, therefore, is this. Is your country led by fools or knaves? And which would be worse? Or is that too philosophical?
A combination of both.
A combination of both.
We will see with Biden. It's too soon. I have great faith in Kamala Harris. I'm hoping Joseph Biden will stay healthy. It will be interesting to see if, let's say, he retires. She's obviously much more to, quote, the left than Biden. But, and we also have some up-and-coming Congress people like Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib, some very powerful voices in Congress for the first time from the Muslim world, who have been quite vocal in this past recent times with the rising tension in the Middle East. But, yeah, knaves and fools on both sides.
Not so much James Bond as Austin Powers.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I'm afraid so.
Fahim Pashtoon Wardag, thank you for joining us. Fahim is a Pashtoon Afghan. Throughout his whole life, he has borne witness to the conflict because, of course, it's 20 years since the US invaded, but there's been war in Afghanistan since 1980. So that's 40 years of war. Fahim has been collecting evidence for 48 years of war and atrocities in Afghanistan. He lost brothers in the conflicts, and at 18 he joined the Mujahideen under the leadership, it says, of the Ikhwan Muslimin guerrillas resisting the, what you call the Soviet occupation. That's a lot of war, Fahim. How many decades? Oh, that's across 5 decades. And you don't look old enough, but tell us what it was like for you and your family.
The Adil Khudai Hospitali Nama. Thank you. It is something unexpected. Like a child, you are sleeping and all of a sudden you hear like stones falling on the roof. And you think, this is not snow, this is not rain. What the hell is this? And you wake up in your dream, and then you find corners to hide from these sounds. You never heard of them. And in the morning, you go outside, you see the body parts of people. And that's the first time in 1978, when I was quite young, I heard and I saw the killings of 9 young police officers who were guarding our homes, and they were killed. I call them WAM, warlords, human rights violators and mass murderers. And that's the first time when I saw body parts at the age of 9. Then your brothers, your family sees this carnage. What do you think? How would it affect on your, psyche? You can't forget it. And then after that, you see the bombings, you see the shellings. It's not 1 airplane, it's not 2, it's not 10. 20, 30 Russian USR airplanes come into a small village and bombing them. And the next day you go there, you see body parts. Destruction. Obviously, as a human being, you feel sorry for your people. And then at a young age, you and your family can do nothing because you're civilians. So you grow with the sense of either culturally revenge for those children, your friends and family members, or seeking justice, or running away from it. Silence cannot do you any good. So it was very hard. It has been the most difficult thing. The wars are coming, and the first war, I was young, I joined the freedom fighters against the USSR after their defeat. 2 years in the Mujahideen, I saw so many contradictions, so many evil actions by those who claim they are, upholding Kalimatullah. And they're doing jihad against the USSR. But they were committing so many atrocities against their own Mujahideen and people that unimaginable that is how I realized this leadership is not for me. I'm not going to follow them. After the defeat of Russians, I left.
Wow. Well, we'll come back to the personal testimony that you have given there, maybe dissect it. But I want to go over, if I may, to Washington first, to get a perspective there from one of the finest young American broadcasters, Rachel Blevins, colleague of mine at RT America. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Rachel, what's the legacy of 2 decades of US occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, the United States has left a legacy of death, destruction, and chaos in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in order to truly understand that, you have to go back to where it all started. In the first days after 9/11, when the Bush administration declared that it was launching a war on terrorism. Now, at the time, they made Afghanistan their first target, and then just a couple years later, they added on Iraq. But at the time, they talked about wanting to defeat this idea of terrorism. And when we look back 20 years later, we're more aware than ever that that is not what has happened. That has not been the byproduct of these wars that have been launched. And instead, you have unimaginable death. I mean, we're talking about millions of people who have died in these two countries, either as direct casualties of war or because they were impacted by the war going all around them. And it's one of those things where we've heard more than one. I mean, we've heard Bush to Obama, to Trump, now to Biden say that they were going to end these wars, that they didn't want them to be forever wars. But when you look at the legacy that the US has left, you see that it has created chaos all around in these two countries. And you now have two countries where the governments that the United States has installed and having the US military there has become something that they have become so reliant on over the last 20 years that now the US is almost ensuring that if it were to pull out, that chaos would then continue for another 2 decades to come, if not longer.
Did the West actually achieve anything in those countries?
Well, the United States and its allies have achieved an incredible amount of control and reliance in this case. Not only are Iraq and Afghanistan and the governments that the US and its allies have funded and created and built up now reliant on the US, not only for funding, but also for its military presence. But it's also achieved a lot when you look at how it has impacted the American people. I mean, you think back to the days when this first started, when you had the Bush administration saying that it was going to go out there and defeat terrorism. And then you had them telling the American people that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And yet the people believed this. They believed the ongoing propaganda campaign that told them that these were the enemies that they needed to send their militaries to defeat. And even now, when we look back and we see that there were no weapons of mass destruction, or we see that the entire Afghanistan war was built upon this lie that it was going to come to an end soon, or that the United States was actually going to win it at any point, what we've learned from that is that the government can build these propaganda campaigns. It can get the mainstream media to comply with what it says, and the people do nothing about it. There is no accountability when those are proved to be lies. And even at a time now, when it's 20 years later, yes, the American people may say that they want these wars to end, but they don't realize just how much of an impact they have truly had on the economies in those countries, but also here at home. I mean, we're talking about a war on terrorism that has cost around $6.5 trillion over the last 20 years. And when you look at a place like Afghanistan, the military leaders there have talked about it. They have shown that the US is fueling chaos all around because they are sending tens of billions of dollars to this country every single year with absolutely no accountability. And what comes as a result of that is that the US ends up funding every possible side. They end up creating chaos.
Has the rule of law been restored to Afghanistan and Iraq?
A lot of what the United States has done has been to rely on that chaos that they have created in the region. When they go in, they bring their military in, they overthrow the current government. They, sort of tell the people that they're electing a new government, but they make sure that it's, supported by the United States. And as a result of that, you continue to get chaos because what the US does is it goes into a country like Iraq, like Afghanistan, where it does not understand the way that their people live, it doesn't understand the cultures, and it decides that it's going to take over and that it's going to run things. Well, that as a result creates a vacuum. And that's exactly what we've seen with the rise of the terrorist group ISIS just a few years ago. You saw this vacuum and you saw places where these smaller little military groups were able to rise up and to gain more power because of that chaos that was all around. And even though the US says that it wants to bring freedom and democracy and that it wants to help these countries out, what we really see is that all of this chaos is by design. It is designed for these countries to then have to rely on the United States. So that if the Biden administration actually follows through with removing troops, bringing our troops home from Afghanistan, from Iraq, even if it's this year, then what happens is when that chaos starts to spiral out of control again, they can just as easily go running back to the country. And then they can tell the American people, well, this is for the good of it. We've got to keep the peace, even when you look at the last 20 years and keeping peace has not been what the United States has done.
Rachel, what will happen post-withdrawal to the giant military bases being left in these countries?
That's definitely a major concern. And one of the things that we've learned from the Biden administration so far in the last few weeks is that they have said that the plan is to bring the troops home, but they've also said that they don't have a plan for the thousands of private contractors that are currently working and flourishing in the country right now. So it seems to be that even if the US says that they want to bring those troops home, they still want to leave enough of a presence in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and likely in Syria. And so it's likely that those military bases aren't going to go anywhere anytime soon because the US still wants to maintain the control in that region. Because at the end of the day, that's all what this is about, is keeping that control, being able to have those bases there to where even if the US military doesn't have as big of a presence in that country, what they can still do is come running right back there, especially if we continue to see the increasing tensions and the increasing conflicts with other countries like China and Russia.
Rachel Blevins, remember her name, $6.5 trillion. There's a number for you, Dr. Lily. I'll be back after the break with much more. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, here in London on Al Mayadeen television, talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. The proximate reason for us doing so is that President Biden has said that the US forces will be withdrawn from both countries. Mind you, Donald Trump also said that, and Joe Biden opposed him in doing it. The Democrats blocked President Trump from doing it. But he probably wasn't going to do it anyway. Big question is President Biden going to do it? $6.5 trillion, Dr. Lily, is what the United States alone has spent in the 20 years of the war on terror. They could have made everybody in Iraq and Afghanistan a multi-millionaire and actually built them a yacht to go and spend the rest of their lives sailing around the Caribbean. Instead, we spent it on war and weapons, and none of it worked, did it?
No, and of course they could have spent it on the Iraqis, but they're not concerned about the Iraqis, whether they live in yachts or in refugee camps. They really don't mind what the impact has been on the Iraqi people. Sadly, that is the same for their government, because every government since 2005 has been killing civilians in Iraq. There were years since 2005 that between 1,000 and 2,000 civilians were killed every year by the government, by government forces, in trying to defeat terrorism. They were shelling Fallujah on a daily basis, and I was counting the dead when that was happening. At some point, they actually isolated cities to starve out the opposition, And that led to thousands of civilian deaths. They had lack of medicine, lack of food. Their own government doesn't care about Iraqi civilians. You think that external forces will care what the impact
Although
is?
these governments were put into power by the invaders. They arrived, these politicians, in these countries on American tanks. In Afghanistan, for example, we have witnessed over the last 20 years, talking about money, some of the greatest thefts of the last century. I don't know how many billions of the trillions has been actually stolen by the political class in Afghanistan. None of it reached the ordinary Afghan man and woman, boy or girl. So it's all been for nothing, is my point.
Actually, I would like to look at it from a different perspective. You called it a blunder or disaster or failure. And I call it the most successful evil project designed in Pentagon and implemented by NATO's invading forces and its partners, who call them WAM or JAPAP, warlords, human rights violators, and mass murderers. And ISI, CIA, and the Taliban, they're all there, co-conspirators to run this project. And you say $6 to $7 trillion. If the war wasn't there, this $6 to $7 trillion would not have been created. General Michael Flynn, the Trump's first security advisor, national security advisor, behind the closed door, he himself said, the conflicts we participate, it's because of a machinery, and it creates wealth. So the $6 to $7 trillion that has been looted for the NATO's taxpayers has been poured into the pockets of defense complex and their acolytes and the co-conspirators and co-criminals at the cost of the genocide of my people. 1 million people have been killed and 80 million people are suffering from depression, and war veterans are on the, PTSD, committing suicides.
Let's go to a man that spends a lot of time in New York, an old friend of mine, Mark Seddon, formerly the media advisor to the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in the UN, and now the media advisor to the President of the UN's General Assembly. Mark Seddon, thanks very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mark, you were working at the UN for most of this last period. How did we reach this stage?
Well, that time that you refer to, the beginning of the Afghan war and also the Iraq war, I was serving on the Labour Party National Executive here in the UK. That's the ruling body of the Labour Party, which was then in power, and Tony Blair was Prime Minister. I recall with some others being extremely alarmed at the reaction to the attacks on 9/11, not only the attacks, but the response and the readiness of the British government under Tony Blair to send the military into Afghanistan, and for a military campaign that his Defence Secretary, John Reid, at the time famously said he thought it would be quite possible for all the troops to come back without a shot being fired. Well, we know now how wrong he was, of course. It seemed an extraordinary thing to do. I joined many others, including Jeremy Corbyn, who many of your viewers will know is a former leader of the Labour Party as well, who was opposed to the Afghan war, as was I. And we were demonstrating, speaking in Trafalgar Square against it. I was blocked from becoming a parliamentary candidate on the basis of my opposition to the Afghan war. And that was also the case with the Iraq war as well. And look, I don't want to keep, too long an answer for you, but just a little bit of history. Harold Wilson was another Labour Prime Minister who was urged by President Lyndon Johnson to join with the Americans in the Vietnam War. And he very wisely said no. And when President Lyndon Johnson said to him, well, Harold, can you please send just a detachment of the Black Watch, who are this fearsome Scottish regiment, because they had been the pallbearers and played the pipes at Kennedy's funeral, Wilson still said no. And in 1967, the Labour government had a policy of withdrawing its military from east of Suez, realizing that Britain was no longer an imperial power, belatedly, perhaps, you may say. But nonetheless, that happened, and Britain withdrew from Aden. So for Tony Blair to launch Britain into two wars in Asia, in Middle Asia, in Central Asia, it just seemed absolutely crazy and wrong.
What's the legacy of 2 decades of occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, I think I haven't been to Afghanistan. I've been to Iraq. I've been to many, as a former reporter and work for the UN, I've been to many countries. So I can't really tell you what it's like on the ground in Afghanistan. All I can say is that that we were promised about peace and democracy and all the rest of it in Afghanistan, of course, hasn't come to pass. Anybody with a rudimentary sense of understanding of history, which the British Prime Minister and the American President clearly never had, would know that to intervene militarily in Afghanistan is to risk monumental defeat. And I'll just give you one other little anecdote. When I started in journalism, I sat next to another journalist whose relative had been the last survivor, a surgeon from the, I think it was General Elphinstone's expeditionary force to Kabul in 1842, and which was defeated. 4,500 British troops were killed in Afghanistan in 1842. 12,000 camp followers were also killed. It was a massive, massive military reversal. The British learned their lesson. They never went further north from the Khyber Pass after that. The Russians didn't, the Soviets didn't, and neither did the Americans. And then the British relearned the lesson again, that you interfere and intervene in Afghanistan at your peril. And so the legacy is one of continuing turmoil.
What did, if anything, the West achieve in Iraq and Afghanistan?
You would have hoped that at least an understanding that there are limits to military power. And you could actually, bizarrely, and I was never a supporter of President Trump, but in one respect, he understood the American view at home that these military adventures were not serving America's interest in any great way and had been pretty disastrous and had expended vast amounts of gold. Trump, for all of the ills of Trump, that much he understood. So there was a lesson learned. I'm not so sure that British political parties have learned that lesson. The legacy, as we see, is one of continuing conflict. The war in Iraq didn't end with the withdrawal of the American and the British troops. It continued. The whole disruption of that country, the country split. When I first went to Iraq, nobody talked about them being, I'm a Shia, I'm a Sunni, I'm a Christian. Nobody ever talked about that. But after the war, they did. This horrible, horrible civil war that followed in the wake of this intervention. And that is another part of history that big imperial powers never seem to learn.
Carol, that's my point, that nothing has been achieved. The war on terror has produced more terror than there was before. There are more terrorists. There are more terrorist organizations, some of which we are still supporting. There is a greater level of capability on the part of those terrorists. Iraq is an unstable, broken jigsaw puzzle of a country. And in Afghanistan, as soon as we have left, the Taliban will be back, and maybe Al-Qaeda and ISIS just behind them. That's a pretty long and devastating indictment, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, just in recent times, the 85, it's believed to be 85 young schoolgirls blown up in Kabul, and that's not exactly an achievement, that everything is calm, the young girls are going to school. This is a school that had been in such a terrible state a few years ago. There was a brilliant documentary made about that school. And it's all fallen to pieces. And that's not the only example. As you say, the terrorism everywhere. And let me make a point about the $6.5 trillion. That could have been used also for every American to have medical care for 30 years. If you sit down, you actually calculate that Americans are going bankrupt, losing their homes still because they can't afford health care. And there's an opioid epidemic in the United States that's gone completely out of control, somewhat related to what we were talking about heroin, about the big money that is to be made in drugs, and that is a huge crisis in the US. Also keeping in mind, as I mentioned before, Michael Oren's book about the American legacy of thinking that they can bring Judeo-Christian values to the rest of the world. You've got 75 million evangelical Christians in the United States who are a big voting force, also the people who are on the extreme right. And if in the next year the Republicans become in the majority in both houses, we could very easily go back to what Mark was trying. He was saying, please, maybe we would learn something. There will be no military intervention. The United States has nearly been bankrupted by the COVID epidemic. The money that has had to be thrown around to help people, to help the American people, the stimulus program, they can't afford another $1 trillion military intervention, but it could happen. That is a great worry for the future.
Mark, has law and order been restored to Iraq and Afghanistan? What will the impact of withdrawal have on the local political situations?
Well, again, it's very difficult to look into a crystal ball. And I've no doubt that the Americans and the British and others will say, well, of course, had there not been this intervention in Afghanistan, things would have been much worse. Well, we just don't know that. I mean, I don't know with Afghanistan, you know, there is a possibility that it could become much more violent in the medium term, in the short term. That has often been the case where vacuums have been left before. And this is the issue, isn't it? It's about leaving a vacuum. So if you leave a vacuum, don't expect that there won't be mayhem and violence.
Finally, Mark, 20 years on, we both gave the best years of our life trying to stop all this. Should we therefore be celebrating the withdrawals?
I mean, I would like to see, you know, personally, a return to international norms. And so we get much greater international agreement on countries working together instead of this divisiveness and military interventions that have failed. Should we celebrate the end of these foreign expeditions that have failed? I don't think there's much to celebrate because too many lives have been lost on all sides. Too many lives have been lost. And those lives were unnecessarily lost, most especially in recent years in Iraq. And frankly, there's never been any proper accountability for those who launched those wars. And that is an absolute disgrace. Global opinion can see this. People can see this and they are appalled. So no, there's not an awful lot to celebrate, but there are lessons to be learned. And let's hope this time lessons will be learned.
Fahim, ontology is important. Let's call the Taliban what they are. They are a backward, obscurantist, brutal organization, but at least they are purely national. They have no intention of occupying Stockholm or Paris. Al-Qaeda and ISIS, though, are all of those things and more, but they are a pan-global threat to the world. They do want to rule London and Stockholm and so on. Is that the future for your country once the US and Britain leave?
No, the future for Afghanistan is quite gloomy. I look at it from the perspective of DPG, Defense Policy Guidance, because the whole war in Afghanistan was orchestrated in the DPG, and Dick Cheney was the head of it in 1990s. So Afghanistan for 20 years was targeted to trigger mass US military upgrade. They made $6 to $7 trillion. I put the figure 3 to 6. So they made $6 to $7 trillion from this war, and the Taliban were not national. They were just like, you know, the grinding mill. They've got two stones. So the Taliban were the base stone for this war, and the government installed, they were the top stone. Inside, on the brains and bodies of my people, Pentagon made $6 to $7 trillion. So they were just making targets, the brains and bodies of my people, targets for this war. So for 20 years, because 2022, DPG would be declassified. Remember, it's 30 years later, that would be declassified. That's one issue, they're leaving Afghanistan. The second issue, Pentagon has got no budget for smaller arms that was used in this theater. So they didn't have budget, they leave them. Like you have a chicken farm and you want to upgrade it to a sheep and buffalo farm. So those small weapons and the small things you have to remove them. For a time you have to, prepare the ground for the sheep farm, bring big arm, big knives, big saws, everything. They are going to create Afghanistan for such a scenario. They would make Taliban in 5 pieces. One would be brought into the government, one piece. The other would be given provinces. The other would be surrogate for ISIS and Daesh to destabilize Central Asia, Russia, and China.
The kind of Groundhog Day,
like what they did in Syria.
But I'm going to have to give Dr. Lily the last word. You're looking back, having carefully diarized, I've seen your work, carefully jotting down who died, how many were broken. You're going, if Fahim is right, you're going to spend the rest of your life doing that in exactly the same places.
Yes, when I joined Iraq Body Count in 2006, I didn't know that 15 years later I'd still be doing this daily count of civilian deaths. This is a war without end, and that is without end whether American troops are officially there or not.
Yes, because the contractors issue that Rachel Blevins referred to, I mean, when does a US soldier become a US mercenary? What's the difference?
That's right. And when there is so little regard for the lives of Iraqi people, then anybody could be causing deaths without any accountability. And the lack of accountability, sadly, is the worst thing about it.
In fact, the contractors are worse than the occupying armies, aren't they?
Yes, they can kill without any repercussions.
Certainly not any military repercussions. And they have forced Iraq, and I'm sure they'll force Afghanistan, to agree a law that Americans cannot be prosecuted by these national jurisdictions if they commit war crimes. They've already done it in Iraq.
Well, we know this is happening in Britain. I don't know if you read the ICC report last December. Very detailed war crimes committed by British soldiers in Iraq. Very, very detailed. Specific incidents, specific tortures, specific killings. And what has happened? It's a 180-page report that the International Criminal Court has come up with. And nobody has been prosecuted. Nobody is being tried for these crimes in Britain. And so if there's no accountability, anyone can keep killing in Iraq, torturing people. Last year, 16 detainees in Iraqi prisons died of torture. Those are the ones who died. You can imagine how many are actually being tortured and don't die. And I recorded those deaths as well, because those deaths just show, A, that there is no accountability, and B, that there is no regard whatsoever.
A total failure, that's the question mark. Withdrawing troops from Iraq and Afghanistan after 2 decades, colon, a total failure, question mark, in a sentence. Carol, a total failure?
I would say a 99% failure. tiny little 1%, because I'm an eternal optimist.
Fahim, I know you're going to say not a failure for them. They made trillions out of it. But from the point of view of an Afghan, a total failure?
No, it's a genocide, destruction of 80 million lives, or the most successful evil project of DPG and Pentagon. The most successful evil project in human history by Pentagon and NATO's allies and their one criminal friends.
I think we'll make that the last word. Dr. Lily, what would you like to say finally?
I would just like to say that from the point of view of bringing peace and democracy to Iraq, it has been a total failure, because what we call democracy now, it really is no democracy.
Well, we could have kept this debate going all night. I suspect you will in your homes after this programme finishes. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kali Mahorra on Al Mayadeen Television. You've been a wonderful audience. Thanks for watching.